Welcome to our extended coverage. I'm David Clement, news director here at the News Forum. Just a year ago, Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad crossed into southern Israel from Gaza and carried out the October 7th massacre. Nearly 1,200 people were murdered that day, with 815 being civilians. 251 Israelis were taken into Gaza and held as hostages, and nearly 100 of those are likely still being held captive. One of the hardest hit communities by this act of terror a year ago was Kibbutz Nir Oz. And just about a month after the attack, we had the opportunity to speak with Anat Shoshani, the granddaughter of David and Adina Moshe. Her grandfather David died that day defending his wife of 50 years, while Adina was taken hostage by Hamas. Now, months later, during a ceasefire and hostage exchange period, she was released back to Israel. But what struck me at the time was the sheer terror that took place that morning. Here is how Anat described what took place on October 7th.
The world should know that they didn't came just to kill people. They didn't came to make a point to release from the occupation or whatever. They came to abuse people. They beheaded babies. They burned people alive. They filmed it. They enjoyed it. They burned down every single house. They had mercy for no one. They shot countless gunshots for everyone who stood on their way. Dogs, babies, children, mothers. They enjoyed it. They took whole families, set them down, murdered the parents in front of their children.
A lot has obviously happened over the course of this past year, and joining me now to discuss exactly that is Israel's ambassador to Canada, Iddo Moed. Ambassador, thank you very much for sitting down with us.
Thank you for having me.
So starting in the south, the communities that were attacked that day, where do those communities stand now? Are they being rebuilt? Are people able to go back to what was once home?
Well, let me start by saying that today is just another one of those most horrible days in our lives in Israel, when we mourn and commemorate an ongoing war that is still going on as we speak. Just this morning, millions of Israelis had to spend time in shelters because a cruise missile was shot into Israel, into the most densely populated areas by another one of Iran's proxies from Yemen this time. The communities in the south are rebuilding, and some of them have gone back to their homes, have chosen to come back to the community and live there. For the most part, they live elsewhere, but they are waiting for the situation to change again, and for the overall majority, they want to go back to their homes and rebuild and reestablish their livelihoods over there in that part of Israel.
And
Many of them, I would just say,
I don't mean to interrupt, but how do they go back if there's a scenario where Hamas still exists in Gaza? Is that even possible or feasible for them to go back if Hamas is left existing?
So I was going to say, indeed, that question comes up in everybody's minds. Most of them are going back again with the same conviction that we can live in peace with our neighbors. But they will go back only and only if they know that they are safe. And that safety has to be reestablished. And it has to be established in two different ways. One is that the source of threat, Hamas terrorists in the Gaza Strip, must be eliminated. That is exactly what we've been doing for the past year. The other part is, of course, internal, that we change our posture, that we prepare a safe enough environment for those communities to be able to live there in security. That is up to us. So there is one thing that needs to be changed on the other side. We are working on that, but we also need the international community's support to radicalize, to demilitarize the Gaza Strip And on the other hand, internally, we have to find new ways to build our own security structure so we can live peacefully and securely.
We have to go to break in a second. When we come back, you mentioned Iran's proxies. This is no longer a one-front conflict, and so we'll have more on that when we return. We're back with Israel's ambassador to Canada. Ambassador, before the break, you had mentioned this morning the Iranian proxies in Yemen. I'd like for you to walk us through the threats that Israel is currently facing right now. I mean, as a Canadian, we share one border with one country whom we've lived at peace with for over 200 years. And so it can be difficult for many Canadians to truly understand the multi-pronged threat that the people of Israel are facing right now. Can you walk us through what those threats are and where they're coming from?
So Israel is a very small country, the size of smaller than Vancouver Island, I would say, and it is located on the eastern part of Asia, and eastern part of the Mediterranean, western part of Asia, a very tiny little country with 10 million inhabitants. Around it, it's surrounded by 22 Arab countries with 500 million people living in there. With some of those countries, Israel has peace agreements with Egypt, with Jordan, with some of the Gulf countries, with Morocco. But there is an overall strife in the Middle East that is controlling actually much of its relations with the region, and that is the issue that Israel has with the Arab Palestinian population in our part of the land. Now, we'll not go into the whole history of it, but we have just to take note of one big thing, one very important development, and that is that Iran has declared many years ago that it would wipe Israel off the map. And for the better part of the last 20 years, Iran has been developing a mechanism, not only for missiles and nuclear and terrorist activity, but also has built up proxies around Israel, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Yemen, in Iraq, and other countries, other parts. So at some point in time, and exactly a year passed from today, Hamas started a war against Israel as a proxy of Iran, in coordination with Iran, after being financed, directed, and armed by Iran. And Hezbollah joined the next day, and the Houthis joined very soon. And in the past year, about 20,000 missiles were shot into Israel from all different directions. 20,000, it's an unimaginable number, and it's still a fraction of what is out there to be shot at Israel still, when we are talking right now. So we have 7 fronts that we are fighting at the same time. And we are fighting for our survival because we understand that we have to win this war, otherwise Israel will not exist. And fortunately, our neighbors, some of them at least, realize that it is not just Israel's war, it's their war as well. And so they are out there, sometimes even proactively supporting us. And that's very important to take note of at this time right now as well.
I mean, obviously, the Iranian link here is a prominent one, whether it be the Houthis, Hezbollah, Hamas. Is there a path forward for peace while the Islamic regime in its current status is still actively funding and perpetuating this terrorism, much of it directed at Israel, but not exclusively? Is there a path to peace if Iran and the regime there is still in its current form?
I don't see one with this regime. This regime has to go. I think that the people of Iran deserve a better government. I think that the region deserves prospering and peace-loving Iran, and the world needs that because Iran has built a mechanism that has a much further reach than just the Middle East. Their missile programs already reaches Europe. Their cyber activity and misinformation, disinformation campaigns have reached Canada. So they're a global threat, and that's why the regime has to go for us to have peace.
Now, I do want to ask you, we have about a minute left before we have to go to break. The size and scope of the displacement now in Israel's north, as you mentioned, that on October 8th, Hezbollah began firing rockets into northern Israel. How many people are currently displaced in the north because of those rockets?
60,000 people are refugees within Israel just from the north, another about 100,000, 120,000 from the south. So Israel is harboring 200,000 refugees. When we're talking about the northern communities, we have hundreds and hundreds of homes being destroyed, livelihoods being destroyed. In the south, we're talking about 10,000 homes being destroyed. It's just unimaginable. But this is continuing as we speak. We are still in the midst of this war.
We have to go to break shortly. When we come back, I want to talk about the international response to October 7th and what's transpired, whether it be in Europe, the United States, or here at home in Canada. So stay with us. When we come back, we will have more with Israel's ambassador to Canada. We're back with Israel's ambassador to Canada. Ambassador, after October 7th, a lot of the very gruesome images were ingrained in the minds of many of those in the journalism world, those who saw either what was posted online or what was then screened for journalists. I want to ask you about the international response to October 7th, because many have pointed out that it's been fundamentally different than other major acts of terror, whether that be 9/11, the Charlie Hebdo massacre, the 7/11 bombings in London. How do you see the international response in a post-October 7th world?
I would divide it into two parts, the region and beyond the region. Countries in the region understood very quickly that Israel is fighting against Hamas, is fighting actually against Iran. And so our neighbors, especially those with whom we have direct and open and official relations, but also some others, understood that and have, in their own way, stood by Israel. What is remarkable to note is that, in contradiction to previous armed conflicts between Israel and Palestinian Arabs, this time Arab countries maintain their relations with Israel, even though they have criticism. Of course, they have. Everybody should. There are people dying. There are families. There are livelihoods being destroyed on all sides, and hopefully that will stop very quickly. But I would say that the Western world have reacted very differently. Given the images that have been displayed on the media and so on, the sympathy and understanding for Israel's plight at the moment have very quickly almost entirely disappeared. And instead of that, we got criticism, we got pressure, political pressure to cease fire. We asked to actually go and compromise with the Palestinians as we speak and negotiate a two-state solution. All of that under fire with a gun held to our heads. And this is just astonishing for many people in Israel that there is such a misunderstanding of the situation. While our neighbors, Arab countries, understand it very, very well, there is a very significant lack of understanding in the West, and I would attribute much of it, unfortunately, to the sources of information that people use when they are trying to understand what is going on.
What do you mean by sources of information?
I would say that social media, which are the major source for younger people, distort the picture. They would operate most of the time in echo chambers. So once people get negative messaging, they will continue to get more and more and more, and will be very convinced that actually Israel started a war on October the 7th, would have no sympathy for the horrors that Israel has undergone, that Israelis have undergone since then, and would definitely at some point even sympathize with Hamas, an organization that is genocidal, that has performed the most horrendous crimes against humanity from October 7th and onward, using its own population as human shields, for example. So I see a big gap there that is unfortunately attributable to the sources of information.
You mentioned a two-state solution, and we've certainly seen that being pushed both at the international level, the national level, and within civil society. Many have argued that that is a solution to the conflict. Is it?
Well, perhaps at the end of the day, but 99 out of 120 Knesset members voted against negotiating a two-state solution now, because we see on the other side the Palestinian Authority that has not condemned the attacks at all, actually in their own way support it. You see an overall majority of the population actually supporting Hamas, and you don't see any single Palestinian leader standing up and saying, we want a two-state solution. There is no one. However, Israel, being a democracy, is being considered as a sort of a softer part in this deal, in this bargain. So the international community presses on Israel, but that it's completely wrong and will not attain anything, even if the United Nations decides tomorrow that Israel conquered the moon for some reason, and there is an automatic majority against Israel. So that will be supported. It's ridiculous. It has nothing to do with the situation. The only way to reach a solution is by negotiating directly. And I would mention just one very important salient fact that is hardly ever mentioned. 20% of Israel's population is not Jewish and lives completely in peace with Israel. Not only that, it is taking part in our war against Hamas and against evil, because they also understand what we are standing for. So even if they are unhappy with many things in Israel internally, they feel part and parcel of the community.
Don't mean to cut you off. We just do have to go to break, but we'll pick right back up as soon as we come back. Ambassador, before the break, you were mentioning the proportion of Israel's population that is not Jewish. Domestically, one of the very popular slogans over the last year, it's also not exclusive to in a post-October 7th world, is that Israel is an apartheid state. What do you say to those who perpetuate that idea that Israel is a one ethnicity, one religion state that treats its citizens differently based on their race or religion?
I would say that were Israel an apartheid state, it's a very lousy one, because non-Jews are members of the Supreme Court. They've been part of the Israeli government. Of course, they are proportionally represented in the Knesset. There are lawyers, there are doctors, there are pharmacists, there are taxis. You'll see them everywhere at any time, and they are free and they have all the same duties and rights as any other citizen in Israel. Minorities in Israel may be very unhappy because there are a lot of segments in the population that see themselves as minorities, be it the ultra-Orthodox or the left or the right or the settlers or the guys from the kibbutzim or Arabs or Christians or wherever they are. Nobody's happy. It's a democracy.
Yeah.
And so if nobody's happy, we know that something good is happening. Of course, we have to address all the issues and all the complaints and all the topics that are on on people's minds, and the government does its utmost to combat that. But it is very important to note it's a free society, and everybody is free to go and do whatever they want. They choose any profession, and so there is total freedom. It is a very complex society, and it's interesting to note that Israel has a Sharia court, or that for family matters, or that there are many other arrangements within the Israeli legal system to facilitate freedom of religion, freedom of expression, and all of that.
Now, one of the other, I mean, there are rallies happening across the country, obviously some to commemorate the victims of October 7th, but there are also numerous and very large rallies called pro-Palestine rallies. Where it gets complicated is obviously the messaging that's echoed at many of these rallies. One of them is from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, which certainly many would argue is the erasure of Israel as a state. Those who are passionate about this claim that they are just anti-Zionist. They're not against Jews or the Jewish people, but they're anti-Zionist. Is there a discrepancy or a difference between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism?
There's a very clear, basic misunderstanding about Zionism. Zionism is the idea that the Jewish people should have a national home on their ancestral land, which is the land of Israel, biblical land of Israel. That's Zionism. So being anti-Zionist is being anti-Semitic. It's the same thing. There is no difference there. And when people try to make that distinction, that actually is an idea to sort of cover their disregard for what Zionism stands for. We've seen, and I would say this is not pro-Palestinian, this is anti-Israel. What we hear on the streets from the river to the sea is anti-Israel. That's not pro-Palestinian. There is nothing Palestinian, so-called. The whole notion of that name, where Palestinian comes from, we can discuss that, but the source of it is invaders, people who came from abroad And actually, the population of Israel, the Jewish population on the land of Israel, has been there throughout all the ages. There was no country there or anything else until the Brits came and decided to establish a mandate given to them by the League of Nations. So let's remember that there is no distinction between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, and that the calls on the streets here are coming from people very often, more often than not, people who don't really care much about democracy, about tolerance, about reaching out between communities, coexistence, and respect for each other. They actually want just one thing, and that is the annihilation of the state of Israel. And I think that the majority of Canadians are opposing that.
Ambassador, I really appreciate you taking the time to sit down with us today. It's a pleasure to speak with you, and we'll be sure to have you back on in the future as the circumstances unfold in Israel.
Thank you for having me, David.
I'm David Clement, and that'll do it for our extended coverage for today. Stay with us, though, because coming up is a Newsforum exclusive airing of a documentary titled The Last Recording. The film reveals the courageous and horrific experiences of Israeli youth trapped inside a shelter during the October 7th massacre.